I knew something was wrong the moment I walked into the lobby, and the receptionist couldn't even look me in the eye. One short email. One rushed meeting. One half-closed office door. And I understood they were about to make their move behind my back. What they didn't know was that I had seen this move coming long before that morning. And when they thought they were pushing me out of the company in silence, they were actually triggering the most expensive collapse of their own making. I knew something was off the second I stepped into the lobby at Arcture Financial. No one had to tell me. No one needed to explain. The whole building felt wrong in that polished, corporate way that only shows up when people are hiding something ugly behind clean glass and marble floors. The receptionist, who normally greeted me by name before I even reached the desk, kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the floor, like looking at me might set off an alarm. I had barely adjusted my purse on my shoulder when my phone buzzed. Outlook. Urgent performance review. 9:15 a.m. Patrick. No message body. No signature. No explanation. Just an all-caps summons like a threat wrapped in calendar formatting. I stared at the screen for a beat, then lifted my eyes toward the lobby windows. 12 straight quarters of growth. 12, 3 weeks earlier. I had closed the Hastings account. A deal projected to bring in $28 million over the next 3 years. I built that thing from a rough sketch on a napkin during a Delta flight. And now I was being dragged into an emergency performance review like I was some junior analyst who mishandled a lunch receipt. If you've worked in finance long enough, your body develops a private warning system. It's not intuition in the soft, mystical sense. It's sharper than that. A vibration in your spine. A low internal alarm that starts ringing when the vultures begin circling. And that morning, every nerve in my back was screaming. I didn't know exactly what they had planned yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty, whatever game they were about to play. They had picked the wrong woman to ambush before 9:15 inches the morning. I slowed my pace as I moved down the hallway. Watching doors. Voices. Body language. Karen's office was cracked open. And I caught the tail end of her whispering to someone in that fake sympathetic tone she used every time she fired somebody. I knew that voice. It was the same one she used when she told Jenny from accounting that her role had evolved beyond its current scope. Which, translated into plain English, meant they had handed her job to a 22-year-old with a ring light and family connections. I kept walking. Expression neutrale. But inside my head, everything was clicking into place. I had just finished 12 consecutive quarters of growth. I had landed the biggest account of the year. There were no performance warnings in my file. No disciplinary notes. No coaching memos. No red flags. So a sudden early morning review with no explanation. Paired with an office full of people, pretending they didn't see me, that wasn't a review. That was theater. Corporate execution. Staged under fluorescent lights. Still, panic would have been the dumbest possible response. I didn't need emotion. I needed clarity. I needed a few extra minutes to confirm whether the move I suspected was the move they were actually making. At my level, you learn a brutal truth: nobody really owns the empire they help build. We rent space inside it. We expand it. We stabilize it. And the moment our value becomes inconvenient, too expensive, too independent, too difficult to control, the same people who praised our leadership start talking about alignment and structure and future vision. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, I already knew what this smelled like. They were going to try to erase me cleanly. Quickly. And with just enough HR language to pretend it wasn't personal. What they didn't know yet was that I had never trusted them enough to leave myself unprotected. I deliberately took the long way instead of heading straight to the meeting room. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed those extra minutes. I needed to read the building before I walked into whatever trap had been arranged for me. A man I had mentored for 5 years spotted me at the end of the hall and practically dove into the copy room to avoid eye contact. A few doors shut too quickly. A few heads turned and dropped. Every guilty little movement confirmed what my instincts had already decided. It was happening. As I passed the mural the CEO had commissioned after our funding round closed, I almost laughed. A giant glowing monument to innovation, full of lifeless stock photo faces wearing VR goggles and pretending to be the future. Not one of the women who had actually done the work to secure the deal was represented there. That, in a single wall-sized image, was the company's entire moral architecture. The real labor stayed invisible. The branding went to men who knew how to smile in board meetings. The closer I got to conference room 4C, the calmer I became. Not because I thought I could stop what was coming, but because I knew I still had one move left before I entered that room. I paused outside my office door and glanced at my reflection in the glass. In environments like mine, survival doesn't come from being the smartest person in the room. It comes from assuming the room will eventually turn on you and planning accordingly. I had done that. Quietly, thoroughly, years before. So, instead of walking straight into their little performance, I turned, stepped into my office, and shut the door behind me. If they were really about to do what I thought they were about to do, then before I faced Karen, HR, and whatever sanitized script they had rehearsed, I needed the one thing: corporate arrogance can never outrun signed paper. I opened the locked bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out my original contract. Most executives sign their paperwork, hand it to legal, and never think about it again. I never had that luxury. 8 pages of legal language sat in my hands. 3 of them personally renegotiated by me after Q4 the year before. I flipped directly to Clause 11C. Read it once, then again, then ran my finger across the initials at the bottom of the page. Karen's. Brian's. Mine. Still there. Still intact. My parachute. My trapdoor. My insurance policy against exactly the kind of cheap maneuver they were about to try. That clause had not been added by accident. I wrote it after watching too many companies pull the same stunt on senior women, terminate them just before a bonus, an equity vest, or a contract milestone, then act shocked when anyone called it strategic theft. I understood how people like Brian thought. In his world, moving fast passed for intelligence. If he could cut me one day early and keep millions off the books, he would call that leadership. So I built a clause designed to punish precisely that kind of leadership. I folded the contract and slid it into my leather portfolio. Then I stood in front of the mirror near my bookshelf and adjusted my blazer. My face was composed. My breathing was steady. I smiled once, not warmly, not nervously, but with the private satisfaction of someone who has just checked that the weapon in her bag is fully loaded. Behind the conference room door, they might have believed they were about to end my career at Arcture with a single typed sheet of paper. What they did not understand was simple: if they pulled the trigger, the recoil was going to break bone. And once it started, there would be no way to unwind it with apologies, optics, or panic. They had arranged a firing squad. I was walking in with the blueprint to the blast radius. By the time I stepped into conference room 4C, the blinds were already drawn. Karen sat stiffly at the table with 2 HR representatives who looked like they had swallowed thumbtacks. No laptops. No water. No performance reports. No talking points pretending this was anything but a clean corporate execution. Karen lifted her chin and tried to summon a sympathetic expression. Victoria, thank you for joining us on such short notice. I set my portfolio down and gave her a thin smile. Of course, I always make time for my team. No one smiled back. She gestured to the chair across from her. But I stayed standing. In front of her was one sheet of paper. I didn't need to read it to know what it was. Karen cleared her throat with all the fragile ceremony of someone preparing to announce a death. I'll get right to it. We're restructuring, and unfortunately your position is being eliminated effective immediately. This decision is final and has been approved by leadership. Leadership, meaning Brian. Meaning he hadn't even bothered to show up and perform his own cowardice in person. I nodded slowly. No tears. No outrage. No bargaining. Just one calm breath and a single response. Understood. Karen blinked. I'm surprised. Maybe she had expected a breakdown. Maybe she wanted one. Maybe she needed me emotional so she could feel justified in what she was doing. Poor thing. She never really knew me at all. We'll need your badge, she added. Almost softly, I unclipped it and laid it on the table. Of course. But the thing she didn't realize was that I wasn't really defeated in that room. Not yet. Because firing me one day before my vesting date didn't protect the company from paying me. It activated Clause 11C. And that meant they didn't just owe me the bonus they thought they were dodging. They owed far more. If you're still with me here, comment 1, because this is exactly where their careful little plan started collapsing in real time. I walked out of conference room 4C as if I were heading to lunch. Not unemployment. Calm. Controlled. Almost amused. Karen stayed behind, probably sweating through her blazer and praying I wouldn't make a scene on the way out. HR didn't follow me. They just sat there like department store mannequins in discount suits, waiting for the next organizational shift to process. I passed my office and didn't bother stopping. They could box up my things if they wanted, or throw them into a supply closet and pretend I had never existed. That was the company way. But what Karen and Brian never understood, what men like them almost never understand, is that I had never played by their rules. I only let them believe I did. In their minds, firing me one day before vesting was efficient, clever, financially disciplined, a neat little executive decision to cut a cost before it matured. But Clause 11C was designed to punish exactly that move. If I was terminated without cause within 24 hours of a major equity vesting event, the company didn't avoid the payout. It accelerated it. Full bonus. Multiplier. Final year base. Damages if contested. Everything. So instead of saving $4 million, they had just triggered a legal obligation worth more than 6. And the beauty of it was that nothing about it was hidden. Brian signed it. Karen signed it. The compensation committee signed it. I had not slipped it in under cover of darkness or buried it in deceptive language. I put it right there in front of them, in clear legal terms. And they signed because they were too arrogant to imagine I might one day need protection from them. I wasn't angry as I crossed the hallway. I was certain. There's a special kind of power in knowing the people who think they've just taken everything from you have actually detonated their own loss instead. They thought I was walking away emptied out. What they didn't know was that every step I took away from that room was taking me closer to enforcement, instead of heading down to the garage like a freshly terminated executive was expected to do. I swiped into the executive elevator and hit floor 45 legal and compliance. I had spent enough time up there during the Hastings negotiations to know exactly who still had a conscience hiding behind their NDAs and polished resumes. The floor always smelled like toner, stale air conditioning, and buried ambition. It was where inconvenient truths went to become official. That morning, I was bringing them one more. The receptionist looked up only after I dropped my leather folder onto her desk. "Tell Aaron Patel I'm here," I said. She blinked. "Do you have an appointment?" I smiled. I was just fired. He'll want to see me. Aaron had shadowed me during several negotiations. He was sharp, serious, and still young enough to understand that legal language meant something beyond internal politics. 10 minutes later, I was in his office. He shut the door and looked at me with the exact expression I had expected, concern mixed with dawning professional dread. "Are you okay? They terminated me." Effective immediately. No cause stated. No mention of the incentive clause. No legal review in the room. I opened the folder, flipped directly to 11C, and slid it across his desk. Aaron read it once. Then again. Slower. His face didn't move much, but his eyes did. They sharpened with recognition. That look lawyers get when something shifts from problem to exposure. I wasn't there for sympathy. I wasn't there to vent. I was there to make sure the right document reached the right hands before Karen or Brian had a chance to rewrite the narrative. I needed this to enter the bloodstream of the company from inside its own legal department. not from a public meltdown or a press leak. If Arcture thought it could erase me through one efficient morning meeting, then legal was about to remind them that contracts outlive executive moods. And mine had teeth. Aaron read Clause 11C again. This time with the deliberate stillness of someone realizing the building above him might already be on fire. Then, he leaned back in his chair. "You added this in the Q4 renegotiation," he asked. I nodded. They initialed every page. Brian even asked what the multiplier language meant. I told him it covered transitional risk if I left. He shrugged. Aaron flipped to the implementation memo and the supporting addenda I had brought with me. "Victoria," he said slowly, "this is airtight. If they terminated you within 24 hours of vesting, they owe full bonus payout, plus 50% of final year base, plus damages if they fight it in arbitration. Correct?" I said. And Karen knew. She signed the implementation memo in December. I've got the PDF with metadata from her iPad. Timestamps. Backups. The whole chain. Aaron gave a quiet, disbelieving laugh. They thought they could short-circuit the payout by pushing you out a day early. But the termination is what triggers the clause. He looked down at the paper again, almost admiring it now. I met his eyes. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for enforcement. That mattered. I didn't want a dramatic spectacle. I didn't want a messy public fight unless they forced one. I wanted the system they trusted to quietly turn on them from the inside. Because they had walked past the warning signs with signatures in their own handwriting. Aaron understood the distinction immediately. Revenge is emotional. Enforcement is procedural. And procedures are harder to dismiss. He scanned the packet, photographed the clause, and emailed the annotated files to himself before I even stood up. As I gathered my portfolio, I told him the only thing he really needed to hear: don't worry about ending up on the wrong side of this. The wrong side was the one that thought I'd roll over. He didn't answer right away. But he didn't need to. I had seen that shift happen in him. He wasn't just witnessing a terminated executive making noise. He was watching a contract begin doing exactly what it had been written to do. I left Aaron's office. But I wasn't done on the legal floor yet. There was one more person I needed to see: Sarah. If Aaron was the person who could understand the danger immediately, Sarah was the one who could trace every buried wire back to its source. I found her in a cubicle far too small for the amount of institutional memory she carried inside her head. Sarah remembered everything: case law, birthdays, internal file structures. My cat's name. I had mentored her when she was still an intern with sticky notes all over her monitor and a naive belief that HR existed to protect employees. 5 years later, she knew better. That morning, I was about to show her exactly how much better. She looked up and froze. "Victoria," I just heard. I slid the folder onto her desk before she could finish. "You heard right. Original contract. Addenda. E-signatures. Metadata. Arbitration triggers. Equity schedule cross-references. I was terminated effective immediately. No cause stated. 1 day before vesting." Sarah opened the folder slowly, like the contents might explode. "Karen signed this?" she asked. She did. Page 6 of the implementation memo. DocuSign from her iPad. Timestamp in the margin. Then she hit Clause 11C and stopped cold. I watched her read it. Then read it again. Then look up at me with a mixture of horror and admiration. "This clause," she whispered. "Yes," I said. "It triggers accelerated payout. Equity multiplier. Continued benefits. Indemnity if they stall. It was built for this." Her mouth opened slightly. They thought they were being clever. I shrugged. They thought I wouldn't notice a last-minute firing with no severance discussion. No legal presence. And no compliance review. I handed her an encrypted drive and a backup index. One copy with Aaron. One in my personal legal archive. One set to trigger if my employment record gets modified without matching clause tags. Sarah looked at me as if she were seeing the full architecture of my mind for the first time. That was fine. Most people only understood me after they had already underestimated me. Sarah sat there in complete silence for a few seconds, staring at Clause 11C, as if legal language had suddenly become performance art. Then she looked up. "When did you even write this?" she asked. I leaned lightly against the edge of her desk and answered. "While I was recovering from pneumonia. I signed part of it in a hospital gown with an IV in my arm. That's how far ahead I was thinking." She let out a short, stunned laugh. The kind that comes when your brain is trying to process something too elegant to be real. I leaned in a little closer. "Sarah, this is one of those moments that defines people. You can flag it and pretend it belongs to someone else. Or you can be the person who sees the fire early and pulls the alarm." I watched the change happen in her posture. Her spine straightened. Her face settled. "I'll take it to Meredith," she said. "Right now." I nodded. "Good." As I turned to leave, she called after me. "What if they try to bury it?" I looked back and smiled. "They can try. Everything is backed up in 3 places with timestamps. 1 copy with Aaron, 1 in my private archive, and 1 in a folder labeled Brian's gift basket that automatically sends the full packet to the board if anyone modifies my employment records without the right clause reference." Sarah's jaw dropped. "You're serious? They like to think I'm just a file folder in heels," I said. "I let them think that. It's amazing what you can build in the dark when nobody bothers to watch you carefully." Then I walked out of legal as if I still owned the floor. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. That's the funny thing about a quiet exit. Everyone assumes silence means surrender. But I wasn't leaving that building defeated. I was leaving it wired. If you're enjoying this so far, hit like, because from this point on, the fallout starts moving all the way to the top. While I left the building in perfect control, Karen was reportedly tearing through HR like a woman auditioning for a public breakdown. Red-faced, blinking too fast, sweating through the lining of her silk blazer. She slammed her laptop onto the conference table and demanded documentation. Any documentation. Shelley from HR looked up at her with wide, useless eyes and asked the obvious question. Documentation of what? Karen, already unraveling, barked back. Victoria's termination. Anything. A waiver. A write-up. A coaching note. An incident log. Something. That, of course, was the whole problem. There was nothing. No formal warning. No disciplinary history. No performance issue. No behavioral note. My file was clean because my record was clean. I had delivered. Quarter after quarter. Without giving them the kind of paper trail they could weaponize later. And that is what made them panic. People like Karen always believe they can rewrite reality after the fact if they move fast enough. But you cannot fabricate a year's worth of concern in one morning just because legal suddenly informs you that your shortcut comes with a 7-figure price tag. At the same time, Sarah had already escalated the packet to Meredith, the board's lead counsel. Within minutes, the matter had transformed from an internal personnel decision into an active legal exposure with timestamps attached. The timing made everything worse for them. I had submitted my clause packet to legal and compliance before HR had even properly uploaded my exit memo. That meant I didn't look reactive. I looked prepared. Which, of course, I was. Karen could scream at archive teams, pull old emails, search meeting notes, or demand someone find something on me. But none of that mattered anymore. When a company fires a senior executive with a spotless file one day before a payout event, the absence of cause doesn't protect them. It condemns them. And the more frantically they search for retroactive justification, the more obvious their bad faith becomes. Meredith entered that chaos like a blade. I wasn't in the room, but later accounts were enough for me to picture it clearly. Meredith was not a woman who wasted emotion. So, if her expression changed, it meant the problem had already crossed the line from messy to catastrophic. She held my packet in one hand, stopped in front of Karen, and asked in a calm voice, "Is this your signature on page 6 of the implementation memo, Karen?" Apparently trying to save herself. Admitted it was before adding the fatal excuse, "I didn't read all the amendments. Brian just said we needed her to stay through Q4. That's the mistake careless executives always make. They think admitting negligence sounds softer than admitting intent. In legal terms, it doesn't save you." Meredith pointed directly at Clause 11C and laid it out in plain English: if an executive is terminated without cause within 24 hours of a major vesting event, the company owes accelerated compensation under the exact formula written in the contract. And yes, my vesting event was scheduled for the following day, meaning by firing me that morning, they had not avoided the payout. They had activated it. By all accounts, the room went completely still. Karen reportedly sat down hard, as if gravity had suddenly remembered her. "We were trying to save the company $4 million. She whispered. Meredith's answer was ice cold. "You may have cost it over 6. And above them, at the board level, calendar alerts were already being pushed out with the highest priority setting attached to my name and the clause review. Meanwhile, I was zipping up my bag and taking one last look around my office. The room already felt smaller, like the walls had shifted inward around the absence they thought they were creating. But what they had actually created was a legal event. The kind that leaves numbers, meetings, resignations, and blame trails behind. And all because they thought one last-minute firing would be cleaner than honoring a contract. I sat at a cafe 4 blocks from headquarters. The kind of place with reclaimed wood chairs, expensive pour-over coffee, and a menu that read like a short story about soil quality. I wasn't there for ambiance. I was there for strong Wi-Fi, a decent line of sight to the front door, and the private entertainment of watching wealthy men in tailored jackets pace outside with Bluetooth panic attached to their ears. I checked my phone and found exactly what I expected: an email from Meredith. Short, cold, legal. My documentation had been received. The timestamps had been verified. My termination file and Clause 11C were under review. No apology. No softening language. Just the clipped tone of professionals who had realized I had not made an emotional threat. I had submitted a case file. I opened my encrypted backup app and looked at the 3 contract versions I had stored there. Every page was clean. Every signature crisp. Every initial from Brian, Karen, and the compensation committee logged with time, location, and version history. I even had a screen recording from the Zoom session where the final equity plan was approved. In it, Brian waved off legal language and said, Yeah, whatever legal wants. Just keep her through year-end. Men say the dumbest things when they think the woman doing the real work will still be around to clean up the consequences. Around me, the cafe continued performing normal life. A freelancer typed furiously at a corner table. A couple debated wine country vacations. Someone laughed too loudly near the counter. And there I was, sitting in perfect stillness, while a billion-dollar company finally began to understand that the executive they had just pushed out had left with the full map of their mistake in her hand. It wasn't joy, I felt exactly. Not revenge. More like confirmation. The rare, almost holy kind. The moment when the world is forced to admit that your caution wasn't paranoia, your preparation wasn't overkill, and your refusal to trust easy smiles had been right all along. On the 44th floor, Meredith apparently laid my packet across the glossy conference table with the care one might use to present a live explosive device. Brian picked it up lazily and dismissed the whole thing at first. This again, she's bluffing. Meredith didn't bother easing him into reality. She's not bluffing, she said. She's executing. That was the fundamental difference between Brian and people like me. He thought power lived in confidence. HI, volume, and room control. I knew power lived in signatures, timestamps, and language that performs exactly as written when tested. When Meredith explained that terminating me inside the 24-hour vesting window had not voided my bonus, but had instead triggered accelerated payout under Clause 11C. Brian reportedly stared at her as if legal had suddenly become a foreign language. Karen stood in the corner with her arms crossed so tightly, her fingers were going numb. But even she couldn't argue with the paperwork anymore. I had already delivered copies to Aaron and Sarah. I had entered the legal bloodstream of the company before HR had even finished processing my exit internally. That kind of sequencing matters. It makes panic look guilty. Not long after, Sarah texted me that Meredith had forwarded the packet to the compensation committee and outside counsel. Things were moving fast. Not everyone is happy, she wrote. I replied, tell me if they try to amend anything retroactively. I have version history on every document. Then I closed my email and opened a crossword app. Because sometimes the most elegant response to corporate chaos is absolute composure. When Brian finally asked the question he should have asked hours earlier, what's the damage, Meredith gave him the answer. Around 6. Sank me yun. Before escalation. He apparently tried to pivot immediately to settlement severance. Half pay. Diane for mining. But by then they had already run into the part of the story they still didn't understand. I had never asked for mediation. Never asked for a package. Never asked for mercy. I didn't need to negotiate with people standing under a structure they had already cracked themselves. The executive meeting that followed sounded less like a strategy session and more like an internal trial. Meredith stood at the head of the table with none of her usual polished diplomacy left intact. Brian, Karen, and the compensation committee were seated with untouched water glasses and unopened notepads. As if some part of them still believed this might remain abstract if they simply delayed touching it. Meredith dropped the document stack onto the table and made the situation plain in the first sentence. This is not a misunderstanding. This is not an HR oversight. This is a financial liability with a lit fuse. And we lit it ourselves. When Brian tried to dismiss me as dramatic, Meredith cut him off hard. She is not bluffing. And this is not drama. This is contractual suicide. She opened the Q4 amendment. Pointed to Karen's signature on page 6. Then to Brian's initials beneath the operative language. Clause 11C. She explained. Didn't merely protect a vesting event. It also covered constructive termination dismissal under circumstances clearly designed to avoid paying an obligation already owed. Their use of the word restructuring didn't help them. It made them look sloppier. Because there was no documented cause. No performance issue. No redundancy file. And no procedural support for the timing. Then Meredith projected the original agreement onto the screen. The room was forced to read the clause in full, line by line, with no executive gloss left to hide behind. When the board chair's signature from 2019 appeared beneath it, the entire room reportedly exhaled in collective dread. I had written that clause years before anyone around that table imagined they might one day push me out. I had built the insurance while they were still congratulating themselves on retention strategy. What the room finally understood in that moment was brutally simple. Small print only feels small when you have the privilege of ignoring consequences. The instant consequences arrive. Every line expands to fill the whole screen. Early that afternoon, I was sitting alone in the rooftop garden of my building when my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I knew who it was before I answered. Corporate panic at the board level has a very specific texture. It's restrained, expensive, and carefully worded. But you can still hear the fracture line beneath it. I answered on the second ring. Victoria Owens. The voice introduced itself as David Halpern from the board. I smiled faintly. David had once quietly tried to recruit me away to a rival firm with enough zeros in the offer to make me pause. He had always possessed one useful talent he knew where the real structure of power sat inside a company. He got to it quickly. Did you intend to trigger Clause 11C? I answered with complete calm. They terminated me. I just made sure I left a paper trail. He went silent for a moment, then admitted he had read the clause, the annotations, and the timestamps. He called it one of the cleanest risk shields he had ever seen embedded in an incentive package. I thanked him politely and listened as he mentioned that Brian still insisted this was an oversight, while Karen claimed she hadn't understood the multiplier language. She understood enough to sign it twice. I said. I highlighted the language in bold in her December memo. Her initials are still in the margin. Metadata intact. Then, another voice entered in the background and recalculated the number aloud. Because of the unvested equity reference and the acceleration ratio, the total exposure was now north of $6 million. I watched a pigeon pacing along the railing while I listened to that news without any visible reaction. David finally asked the real question. What do you want? I looked at the clouds and told him the truth. I don't need anything. I wrote the rules for this years ago. They just forgot I never stopped editing them. That was the end of the mystery. The board wasn't dealing with an emotional ex-executive. They were dealing with design. The real crisis hit when the CFO confirmed the final number in front of leadership. From everything I later pieced together. The room nearly stopped breathing when Meredith turned to him and told him to say it out loud instead of letting Brian keep pretending the exposure topped out at $4 million. The CFO, a man usually pink-cheeked with the soft confidence of someone who believed spreadsheets could keep him safe from consequences, had apparently gone paper white. He looked down at his calculations, took one long breath, and said it plainly with the equity recalculations. Acceleration terms and contractual damages. The company owed me $6 million. Minimum. Karen reportedly whispered one word back like it was a foreign concept she had just discovered too late. Multiplier. That would have been funny if it weren't so revealing. She had signed something she never bothered to understand, because she assumed the details were for people beneath the level of decision-making. Brian, of course, responded in the only way a man like Brian can when reality contradicts his self-image. He accused me of planning it, of setting them up, of protecting myself too thoroughly. Meredith shut that down immediately. She protected herself, she told him. You walked straight into the teeth of a clause she flagged for you. That was probably the moment his confidence cracked. Not when the clause surfaced. Not when legal confirmed it. But when no one in the room rushed to save him. Men like Brian survive for years on the assumption that authority itself is a defense. That if they speak with certainty, others will confuse it for competence. But once the damage becomes numeric, time-stamped, and attributable, confidence loses all market value. And that was the point people kept missing. The $5 million wasn't the story. It was the invoice. The real story was that a company built on my labor had believed it could cut me loose one day early and call that smart governance. The money was simply the amount required to correct their misunderstanding. Soon after, the board summoned the entire leadership team to what everyone knew was a reckoning. Even if no one dared use that word, there was no agenda attached. No cheerful assistant offering coffee. No soft corporate language about alignment or updates. Just a meeting invite with urgency attached, and a room full of people who had finally understood that the fire was not metaphorical anymore. Brian sat at the head of the table, stiff and defensive, like a teenager waiting outside a principal's office. Karen sat to his left, visibly trembling. A legal pad in front of her with the word defensible written over and over in different handwriting styles. As if repetition could somehow conjure strategy. HR looked ready to resign from life itself. The CFO kept pressing 2 fingers into his temples like he could physically force reality backward. Meredith read Clause 11C aloud one last time. Slowly and clearly, making sure there was no room left for interpretation. Then she looked directly at Brian and asked the simplest possible question. Did you pay her before the termination processed? He blinked. Confused. We terminated her before it vested. That was the point. By all accounts. The room went silent enough to hear a career split open. Meredith's expression changed in that terrible way professionals have when they realize they are now explaining basic mechanics to someone who should never have been given power. The CFO then confirmed that my counsel had already submitted formal notice to collect damages, complete with backup files. internal emails, and timestamps. The issue was no longer whether they would pay. It was who the board would hold responsible for creating the exposure. And when Meredith said the board might not stop at forcing a payout, that they could pursue personal liability if they found malicious intent, Brian finally understood this wasn't just a company problem anymore. It was becoming his problem. Personally, that is when authority stops feeling glamorous. The minute consequences become individualized, titles lose their shine. A few days later, I was standing barefoot on the balcony of my Austin hotel room, staring out at a skyline full of glass towers and ambition, when my phone lit up with a new email notification. The subject line was almost laughably clean. Settlement package, Arcture Financial. Attached were the agreement, payment confirmation, and a total.sex. Wu by Bashalo, Liang by Wusher. Ling. There was also an NDA giving me 5 business days to sign and agree to no public disclosure without express board approval. I didn't open the NDA. I didn't need to. The number was there. The payment was real. The damage had already happened. And the company hadn't even managed to spin it into a respectable story before wiring the money. There was no polished press release about strategic direction. No triumphant messaging about leadership transition. Just a quiet purge dressed up as restructuring. Karen had already resigned to pursue new opportunities, which is corporate internet language for being shown the back staircase with whatever dignity the company can salvage. Brian had been reassigned to some newly invented innovation role with no budget and no real office exile in a blazer. One of my old team members even leaked a photo of his new title badge to me. It translated neatly into plain English stripped of power. Still dressed for optics. I didn't return Meredith's voicemails, or Sarah's, or David Halpern's late-stage offer to connect me with advisory boards. It wasn't anger. It was completion. I didn't need sympathy, networking gestures, or retrospective respect. I already had the only things that mattered: their signatures, their wire transfer, and my freedom. There's a strange peace in watching people discover too late that the woman they underestimated was the one person in the room who had planned for betrayal more carefully than they had planned for greed. That evening, I sat beside the rooftop pool, legs stretched over sand-colored tile. A ridiculous cocktail with an unnecessary garnish balanced on the small table next to me. The city glittered in the background like a $1 million apology. Westridge Capital had flown me out after hearing enough whispers about how I had taken down a CEO with a single clause. They weren't offering me a good fit role. They were offering me a real seat at the table partner track. Strategy division. Autonomy. Equity. And a pen to shape terms instead of just signing whatever terms someone else drafted for me. That, more than the money, was what made me smile. I had walked out of the ashes into something bigger than the job they thought they were taking from me. I opened my phone and scrolled to the last number I still had saved from my Arcture days, the board chair. I typed one sentence, clause 11c. Line 22. Then I attached a photo of my feet pointed toward the skyline. No caption. No emoji. No explanation. Line 22 was the final sentence of the clause. Written in my own language after 2 late-night calls with legal and a nearly empty bottle of wine. Failure to honor these terms shall constitute not only breach, but a systemic lapse in judgment, subject to restitution, review, and reputational consequence. Brian had laughed at that wording once. Now the whole clause had played out exactly as written. I hit send and watched the screen dim. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not revenge, not triumph. Something cleaner than both. Clarity. I hadn't burned that bridge. I had walked away from it with the deed in my hand, sold the land underneath it, and charged them rent for the ashes. That was how I left. Not erased, not disgraced, fully paid, fully seen, and finally beyond their reach. If you love workplace revenge stories where the comeback is smarter, colder, and completely by the rules, subscribe now. There are plenty more stories of coffee, corporate chaos, and perfectly timed consequences still ahead.